Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mindful Metal Jacket. I am Joe List, and I am being blasted by the sun through my window, and it's shining off my forehead and looks ridiculous. My glasses, too. But if you're listening to just audio, well, you are fortunate because I got a real goofy face here. But what I do is I meditate and I let go, and I can even stop identifying with my face. Those are some of the gifts of meditation. Welcome to the show. I appreciate you guys bearing with me through this temporary period of hiatus, but I'll have you know that I've started recording episodes again. I recorded one with Sam Morrill, which will be out soon, which was one of my favorite episodes. And my pal Matt Wayne, who's hilarious, will be on the show soon. But right now we're working on these compilations in the meantime while I get my schedule in order. And this episode I'm really excited about, and I'm grateful for the producers of the show that put together this little compilation called The Joy of Meditation. And it's got some highlights from some of our best episodes featuring some of our best meditators and meditation teachers, including the great Sharon Salzberg, who is something of a legend in Dharma circles. She's one of the sort of people really responsible for bringing Eastern philosophy and meditation to the West. And she was quite a get. And she's on here. She's a legend. You can look her up or ask anybody that knows anything about meditation. And they know who Sharon Salzberg is. So she's in here, as well as Kevin Griffin, who's fantastic, who's another meditation teacher. Also, Shafi Hossain is one of my good buddies. He talks a lot about it as well. And then Cory Allen, who's a friend of mine, who's great, and also a meditation teacher, and he's got his own podcast called Astral Hustle, which is great. I recommend everybody check that out. So it's a little compilation of all of them, all talking about meditation. And I love meditation. It's the best tool in my toolbox, and it's changed my life. I do it every day, multiple times a day, throughout the day. And I think there's a lot to be learned in these little clips, and a lot of great books out there. I recommend anything by Thich Nhat Hanh, Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, who I just met yesterday, who I hope to have on the show someday. We'll see. John Kabat-Zinn, Jack Kornfield, Cory Allen, who's on the show, has a book. Sharon has a book. Pema Chodron. A lot of great meditation teachers. And of course, the Sam Harris's app, the Waking Up app, is one that I've fallen in love with, and I love. The Calm app is another great app with Tamara Levitt that I use a lot. So a lot of great places. YouTube has a lot of great stuff too. And here you're going to hear a lot more about it. I appreciate you listening to the podcast, and welcome to all of the new folks that may have joined, heard about it on the Joe Rogan Experience. We appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe to the show, leave a nice review, and subscribe to my YouTube if you would. Leave a comment, thumbs up, all those algorithm things. Really grateful. And like I said, there'll be new full interviews coming soon. I already got one in the can. It'll be out in the next week or so. So I appreciate it. I hope that you're doing well, and I hope you take some moments to meditate. And here's a little quote from the aforementioned John Kabat-Zinn, who it's hard to read because I took my glasses off because they were reflecting in the sun. Anyways, John Kabat-Zinn said, "It is indeed a radical act of love just to sit down and be quiet for a time by yourself." Maybe before you listen, pause and just enjoy some silence by yourself, and then enjoy these conversations. Thanks again for listening. I love you. I haven't listened to the podcast that much, but I know your book, and I talked to you recently on your podcast, and it seems extremely philosophical, and there's a lot of, the book is about mindfulness. So is the podcast not comical now?
Well, here's the thing. It is comical to a degree. Like, I joke around pretty constantly, probably more than the guests would like, but it's about, the inner life, but in a deep way. But like that shit, if you're not laughing while you're talking and thinking about, the inner path, I think that you're missing a huge part of the point of it all, right? I think that like the just the comedy and the absurdity of existence as it is so overwhelmingly connected to all of the meaning and purpose of existence. And to me, pursuing those two things simultaneously not only is fun, but it actually inoculates one or the other against the indulgence of the self, right? So if you get too serious, then you start, you turn into an asshole and you start just talking platitudes and shit like that. And then you lose your sense of humor. You become too hard. It's kind of like the Alan Watts thing. You want to be Prickles and Goo, not too gooey, not too prickly, Prickles and Goo. So the show is Prickles and Goo.
That's a great name for a podcast.
Yeah,
especially if you had a partner. One of you could be Prickles and one of you could be Goo. But that reminds me of a thing I remember reading. I forget in which book, but it was saying if you laugh hard enough, you'll start to cry, and if you cry hard enough, you'll start to laugh. Mm-hmm. So those two things are both sort of natural and what's that word? See, this is where I get intimidated by your intelligence.
Remember, it's relative, man.
What do you call it? Involuntary. There's sort of involuntary things that are very close to each other. And
yeah.
I'm sure you're somebody that talks about, is aware that good and bad are two sides of the same coin. Happy, sad, whatever, positive, negative. You can't have one without the other. Am I correct in thinking that, or am I
You're
way
correct.
off on that?
You nailed it. And not only is it that, but let me just put a little pepper on that, because I've thought about this a great deal. And this may, hopefully this isn't too far into the thing you're just talking about, but I had an interesting insight about 4 years ago whenever I was just going along, prodding at my brain as usual. And I began to realize, I had some sort of extreme experiences, and then I began to realize that I was, because of the inheritance of my baggage, essentially, all of my preconditioned behavior and ways of thinking, given my family environment and so forth. I kind of grew up forcing myself to see the positive in everyone, right? And it's this time I had this realization that was happening. And if you read about, are you familiar with attachment theory, like John Bowlby's theory of attachment? Just being in therapy, you might.
I don't know specifically that guy's theory. I mean, I'm aware of, I've read a bunch of Buddhist stuff and the idea of attaching to thoughts and the attachment. I understand some amount of non-attachment, of not attaching to your thoughts and your feelings, and that you are not your thoughts. I mean, is that anything?
That's the thing, but it's not what I was talking about.
Okay, great.
Definitely a thing.
But you could see how I would think that was attachment theory.
100%, yes. And there's actually a guy, George Haas, that blends the two. But Bowlby is like a Western psychiatrist that developed the theory of attachment, which basically whenever you're born, you have either a destructive, constructive, and secure, insecure attachment with your parents. So the idea is, and this could just be from our discussion of the day, I thought this might actually be something you would find interesting and useful to think about. But whenever you are born into your family, we naturally, want a secure attachment to our parents. They're supposed to be a place of unconditional love. And so when we go out into the world to individuate and to, become ourselves, the world is not necessarily trustable, but it's testable. But knowing that we always have this secure attachment and unconditional love with our parents, it allows us to go out and explore the world confidently, always knowing that we can return to safety. If you are not shown that love and you're not, groomed with the appropriate secure attachments as a child, you feel disconnected from your family. So you don't have that conditional love from your parents. But then what happens whenever you grow out, begin to try and individuate yourself and go into the world, you then don't have a trustable base to go back to. So whenever you're trying to explore the world, you become trapped in between two polarities of an unsecure home, base, and then the world also seems unsecure. So what usually starts happening is you become this weird, singularity chameleon thing where others around you start auto-regulating your emotional states. because you're just trying to find both of those, like the appeal of and comfort of unconditional love and the trust and the exploration all at once. And it doesn't really work that way. So you end up being like, well, if I'm in a room with someone who is happy, then I'm happy. If I'm in a room with someone who's angry, then I'm angry. And I'm going to talk to them about their anger and try and help them to build that security. So after I got into that and started reading about it, and by the way, the guy George Haas is a mindfulness teacher that uses mindfulness meditation and attachment theory to help kind of quiet the mind and then allow that negative space to, therefore, like when the arising thoughts and the realizations of those attachments calm, then you can kind of process them using mindfulness. Anyway, so whenever I kind of like got into reading about this and thinking about it myself, I discovered that like that was definitely what's happening. So I started trying to approach people with a bit more objectivity and not allowing them to co-regulate my emotions, pausing and be like, okay, what am I thinking and feeling right now? And like, what do I need right now? And how much of myself should I give to this interaction? How much should I allow myself to become emotionally involved in another person's current experience? And in that kind of exploration, I realized that I was very much always giving everyone the benefit of the doubt and trying to see the best part of everyone, because I came from a very negative background. And so I sort of had to see the positive side to have some sense of hope, And so whenever I stopped doing that and I pulled back a little bit, I saw that I really started seeing the negative as well of people, right? So if you're always like kind of looking for the positive and you take a step back, then, well, wait, hold on, there's this other thing. And then that becomes really challenging, because now once you start seeing the negative of people, that becomes very loud because you're unused to seeing it with such relief, right? And so it was like a good 6 months to a year of me just like really struggling with not getting irritated or even judgmental about, seeing kind of the dark side of we all have it, seeing that dark side. And I realized as I thought about it further, like that we shouldn't coddle the light side or judge the dark side, because really, and to the beginning, to your notion about the two sides of the same coin, there is the dark and the light, there's the heads and the tails, but there's actually a third part of it, which is the observer. So that's you, right? So the observer of the dark, the observer of the light, and the observer of the coin that's either ending up on heads or tails is the part where you come in. So it's actually a trinity, right? So even two sides have a third side, which is your perception of those sides. And you can move past the judgment of the dark and the coddling of the light by simply speaking through those things, not getting invested in them, and speaking to the center and the heart of the individual outside of judgment or outside of creating security for yourself.
I mean, see, this is where I get intimidated talking to you, because you say so much that I'm like, that reminds me of this. Oh, I should say this. I thought of this, and I'm now my circuits have all broken.
You topsy-turvy?
Yeah, I've lost all bearings on where I am. My compass is gone, and the sun is behind a cloud, and I don't know where I am. But that's an interesting thing that made me think of something else I've heard before and read and now I've just read so much Stoicism and Buddhism and mindfulness that I don't know where I read whatever, but
sure,
that made me think of the theory that reality is neutral and everything is just perceived through us and could be looked at one way or the other. Is that something that you think about or believe in? Is that true?
That has been my major obsession for like 20 years.
Is that the world, there's not an inherent evil in the world or an inherent good in the world, it's all perception?
Well, that gets, well, there's okay, that's a big question. So there's what one puts forward is there's the moral landscape of the natural world, which can kind of objectively have suffering and victims and quote unquote heroes and so forth. How one perceives and quantifies that natural moral landscape is what you're kind of getting at. And yes, that is completely subjective. So I've talked about this just sort of, it's such an abstract idea, I think, for someone who hasn't thought of it before. But I've put it in a way that, like, imagine the world outside of your skin, right? So everything that exists outside of your skin is the objective world.
Right.
You are the subject because you're the one that's looking at the world outside of your skin. And so your nervous system, which contains all of your senses, is like an instrument in a laboratory taking a reading of the world outside of your skin at all times. So you're getting all the data and information about, what's in the room around you, all that type of stuff. But then based upon your, as I said earlier, your genetics, your inherited family structure, the culture, your set of unique chance experiences, all of those things form, neural imprintations, which begin to slowly shape your worldview of the world. So as you perceive the world through your senses, it is filtered through your subjective, one of my mentors calls it reality tunnels. So it basically, you have your flavor and your angle or your, framework of how you're perceiving everything.
Right.
And really, we're really quickly approaching the key of Buddhist enlightenment. But I'll stop there and we'll go on.
Well, so I've also heard or read recently that there's a clever, fun saying, if it's hysterical, it's historical, that everything you react to, the way you react to everything, is learned in the first 6 or 7 years, the formative years, as they would say. So
Right.
like when I am in line at the bagel place and the guy in front of me is ordering 9 bagel and it's taking longer than I wanted, and I'm like, what the fuck this guy? There's a theory that is all drawn back to something that happened to me when I was 4 or 5 or 6. That's where I learned, whether my parents reacted that they were impatient or they were anxious or their perception of time and we're running out of time and we have to get things done.
Right.
Is there any, do you feel any connection to that theory or thought?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like everything. Basically, there's if this couldn't get more nerdy, here we go. So there's this guy Alfred Korzybski, he's the guy that wrote the book of General Semantics and non-Aristotelian theory, like in the 1930s. I used to be a big fan of his when I was in my 20s. So anyway, he has an interesting thing because he really got into, this type of stuff in a deep way. Like he did this experiment where he just didn't talk for a year just to try and understand how language shaped the way that we think, and it shaped, the way that we see the world. Anyway, so he has a thing in his book, Science and Sanity, that no one listening to this should buy because it's like a 900-page tome that's very impenetrable.
Yeah. These people all came from Tuesdays with Stories and You Know What Dude podcast.
Oh,
so
farts.
we might have
great.
to start, we might have to start dumbing this down just a little, with respect to the fans and myself. I mean, so
yeah, no. Anyway, basically, okay. So there's a thing in there called the structural differential, which there's gonna be one dude listen to this that's like, oh my god, I know this. But anyway, the structural differential is like this model that he created. Short of it is that every initial interaction you have with like a one-to-one singular experience is like creates the biggest impact of how you'll see and relate to that thing moving forward. And then each future experience, the impacts become smaller and smaller. So like if you get stabbed, if your first experience in like elementary school with a pencil is someone stabs you in the thigh with a pencil, like that's pencil 1. And then from then on, even if you have plenty of great positive experiences with pencils, there's still going to be this like weird biological subconscious resistance and a discomfort around pencils because of that initial experience. But like all the contents of our entire life and our minds operate by the same principles.
yeah, see, that is fascinating to me. And one of the scary things about having a child is that no matter how hard you try and how good of a job you do, they're still going to be fucked up in some ways. But that is also the nature of life, and that could even get into Stoicism, which I have a hard time saying that, is that horrible things are going to happen, and that's just reality, and it's unavoidable. I mean, that's another thing I've been reading a bunch about and sort of studying lately, is the idea that which is kind of obvious, but it's obvious on the surface as a statement that you can't avoid negative things, bad things, but somehow, even though it sounds obvious, people maybe consciously or subconsciously think that you are able to, which is where so much I feel like anxiety and stress comes from, is people trying to control and never have an unpleasant experience of, flossing so they don't have to deal with the dentist, and eating healthy so they don't have a heart problem, and wearing a seatbelt so they don't get in a car accident, which are all positive things. But ultimately, you cannot avoid some sort of crisis, tragedy, negative thing in life.
Yeah.
So which is where acceptance comes in, which to me, I talk about a lot on this show. Everything I study, from sobriety, recovery, and mindfulness, and Buddhism, and Stoicism, and therapy, the one common thread throughout all of those is acceptance.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel like you don't seem like you're someone particularly anxious? Maybe that's because you're young, but your father has it, and so does it not work? Is it something that you're like, I can't control this, so I can't worry about it too much, or do you just feel like you're young and youthful and you don't care about other people?
Right. Like the idea of anxiety and depression is such a, coming from Bangladesh, it's very different, I guess, right? So it's like a journey completely on its own for me, of like how I kind of understood depression, how I kind of got introduced to anxiety, how I kind of found myself, right? It's like, it's a lot of different things that can add to your anxiety and depression. I feel like it's not by its own. So when I was like 10, I think I mentioned this, that my mother, my sweet mom, she introduced me to this Quantum Foundation in Bangladesh, which is the biggest foundation for meditation. And meditation is not something that people really talk about in Bangladesh before this. Before this, meditation was not something that people did. And so the reason my mom introduced Quantum Foundation to me is because they had like a student program, which was all about like mantra meditation. You would give yourself like positive affirmations that, oh, you're going to study today, or you go to they do this place. It's called like a dream house, where you go to your dream house, and then you have a command center where you go to that command center and command yourself how you're going to spend the day. Right? Like how you're gonna spend 2 hours of studying, 2 hours of working out, 2 hours of playing whatever you want, you tell your brain. And because like there's enough scientific evidence that shows when you're meditating, your brain goes to that theta state where it's more prone to taking suggestions from yourself, because like you're just like thinking about it differently, not like just being autopiloting throughout the day. So my mom's like motivation was that I'll be a better student through that. So that's why she made me do it. And that was like the best thing I've ever done. Like I was so blessed to like find this thing that my parents don't really, like everyone in my family kind of went through this meditation track, like the boot camp that I went through, but they don't really practice it as much as I do now. So I've been very lucky with being exposed to meditation at an early age. But then like the idea of depression is not really like talked about in Bangladesh and South Asian communities. And I'm sure you know about this it's not like really prevalent to talk about. It's just like something like Bigfoot. Like, what is that about? We don't really, you know what I mean? We don't really understand it. So we don't really talk about it.
And why is that? Is it like the way in Ireland they don't talk about things, or is it taboo, or is it just?
I guess when you have people dying from poverty, people don't get to talk about depression yet. You know what I mean? They're like bigger problems, I guess, and that's why it's like cornered, which is not good, because that could lead to like so many other problems that people don't really understand. It's like it's a manifestation of other things that people don't realize, I guess, and that's why it's not given. Like one common thing about every part of the world is that we care more about dental hygiene than about mental hygiene, right? Like we brush every day, floss every day, but like no one talks about going to a therapist as often, you know?
Right.
which is insane because you rather have yellow teeth than have to cry at Starbucks again or something like that. Like that would be crazy. Like why would you? Like people have cavities, but I'm sure what hurts more is the void in their soul. You know what I mean? Like why would you not go to a therapist? It's way more important.
Yeah, completely. And to me, that's like the dream, like to be 10 years old and be introduced to meditation. Like I think we should be introducing young children in like preschool and kindergarten to meditation. I think like all of the world's problems, not all, but so many of the world's problems would be solved if we started teaching meditation and mindfulness.
Oh, 100%. I completely agree with you. Because like that was something that was always in the back in my head, that meditation is something that you can use to really harness your brain, right? But I never really truly appreciated it till I went to college, right? When I moved to the States and I met people that were really depressed. So like I feel like there are three types of sadness, right? There's the clinical sadness, which is like you really need drugs to treat them, right? And then there's sad, which is like toxic people just being sad. And there's good sad. There's like no happiness. I think there's good sad, meaning that you get sad, but you realize why you're sad and you try to affect change in your life, right? Because like people like with the amount of trauma and sadness we have in the world, it's obviously very reasonable to be upset about things, right? But like the way you deal with it, I guess, is kind of what is up to you, right? And my introduction to Stoicism, I guess, was one of the biggest things that kind of changed how I look at life, right? Like Stoicism's idea of negative visualization and goal setting of like what? Oh hell yeah, I love that book.
I got a guide to the good life, the ancient art of stoic joy, right next to me.
Yeah, that's a book I sent to all of I have a PDF version of that book, which I will send to every single of my friend who wants to learn about Stoicism. Like William Arvin, that guy just changed my life. It was just like one of the best books I've ever read. And so good. You want to talk about how you came across it and how you feel about the book?
I feel like I interrupted you because I got so excited that you mentioned Stoicism, and I just happened to be holding this book a moment before. This is what I was reading right before we started recording. And I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, I sent a copy to Robert Kelly, who's got some mental problems, certainly. And I sent a copy to him. He's also a past guest, and he was terrific on the podcast. But Stoicism. Now, when did you, I'll talk about when I discovered it, but when did you discover it? I want to hear.
I discovered in college, and there was a reason behind that. I guess I was becoming more, because I grew up kind of religious, right? And then I kind of was moving away from it. And there's this void, right? Like God is this huge deal, right? For people who are religious, this huge deal. And once you're like moving away, you feel very scared, because like the other book that kind of changed my life was The Denial of Death, which kind of plays hand in hand on how I look at the world. Because that idea is pretty much how, like in the book, the author Ernest Becker kind of posits the idea of how humanity is just a reaction to the idea that we are all mortals and we don't like to die. We don't want things to end. So we created these three things to solve that problem. One of that being is like, we're not actually dying, we're going to heaven. That solves that problem right away. So that, like having that in my head, I was like, okay. So like that makes sense. Like how can I cope with stuff like that? How can I be okay with death? And that was kind of my journey to finding more philosophy, like reading more about Stoicism and The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And all of that kind of helped me understand myself and just make me more grounded.
Right.
Because like if you look at if when I started looking at my friends who are like engineers, very smart people and doing great things in like their companies and whatever, but they're never like happy. They're always chasing the next thing. And it's like they feel like, and comedians as well. I have like so many friends, and I'm sure you have seen that as well, where they're always like looking for the next Netflix special or the next big thing, right? Like, for example, if you're an open micer, you want to be on a show. If you're on a show, you want to be on a festival. You have a festival, you want to have a late night. If you're on a late night, you want a Netflix. You want a TV show. The baseline of your happiness is always going to shift because you're never in the present. So like when I see my friends going through that, I made it my goal just to be okay with where I am, but at the same time doing things I love every day to counteract the anxiety. It's like I have a checklist of things that, if I am anxiety, I know what things to do that will make me happy, if that makes sense.
In control of the arising of our thoughts, and I think that is a very forgiving reality, because usually we blame ourselves so mercilessly for what we're thinking, what we're feeling. It shouldn't be there. It should be over it. I've been in therapy, I've meditated all these years, and realizing that we can't control what arises in our minds, but we actually can relate very differently to what arises in our minds. And so we can be kinder to ourselves. We could remember it's not just me. This is kind of part of human conditioning, or many people have this tendency, give yourself a break. Right. Like if you blame yourself for an hour and a half, that is not going to leave you with a lot of energy to start over, and right. It's going to leave you exhausted. And so it's just not that skillful a reaction. And so we kind of say, well, I've been down that road before. Let me be kinder to myself. Things like that. We have lots of options in terms of how we relate.
Yeah, my therapist always gives me the advice, and I'm sure you've heard it and read it before, and I read it places, is that advice to be as kind to yourself as you would be to somebody else. Because I would never, if my wife tried meditating, I wouldn't go, yeah, but I bet you were thinking a bunch of thoughts, you dummy. I'm like, what's the point? You're still going to have anxiety. Like, it would be viciously mean, which we tend to be to ourselves, which I don't know what the science behind that is, but it's horrible. I feel that way all the time in my career and everything, all these things of, but you're still not making that amount of money. That one person hated your act or whatever it is. And so, and I talk about this a lot on this podcast, and I've read it a lot too. And maybe you could speak to it, or that the idea of meditation is sort of deepens the grooves of it works that muscle to kind of go back into that quieting the mind and sort of recognizing that thoughts are just thoughts. Because if you're not doing that, that's just your habit, is to go back into maybe self-hatred or believing whatever thoughts you have, and sort of, so it's trying to kind of undo that. Is that one of the things of mindfulness?
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's sort of knowing the difference between what's actually arising, thought, feeling, sensation, whatever it is, and what we're adding to it. Like a very common thing would be you feel physical pain or discomfort, or you feel emotional pain, you feel heartache, you feel disappointment. And right away you start thinking, what's it going to feel like tonight? What's it going to feel like tomorrow? What's it going to feel like next week? So not only are you having to deal with what's actually happening, which is that something hurts, but you've now added all that anticipation on top of it, and it feels overwhelming, because it is overwhelming, Right. And so that's a habit. It's just a habit to add the future, right. When something doesn't feel good, or, what we were kind of talking about before, I shouldn't feel this, I've been in therapy all this time. Why am I still angry? Why is this still coming up? Or I've been meditating for 50 years, for God's sake, why is this still coming up? And, it's just like, if you think about the energy that we expend in judging ourselves, which only leaves us exhausted, and demoralized. It doesn't leave us with like, I'm going to learn not to do that again, Like, right. It's not like a tool of resilience by any means. And so, that's what we learn to undo, not the original thoughts, feelings, sensations, because that's just life, things arise because we are very conditioned in certain ways. And so, but we can be totally different with what arises. Right. And that's like it's very possible. It's not unreal or imaginary, and it's freedom.
Right.
You know, like also listening to, I think about my friend, one of my colleagues, Sylvia Borstein, who she's 81 or 82 now, and she describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer. And that's what drove her to learn how to meditate, was because she was suffering so much from, as she put it, she'll describe herself this way, like, I'll call one of my adult children, and they're all like in their 50s and 60s now. I'll call one of my children and they don't answer the phone. So my first thought is, well, they must be dead.
Right.
So it never occurs to me they're taking a shower.
Right.
Or they just fell in love. They don't feel like talking to their mother.
Right.
And, and that's what got her to meditate, was I have to deal with my mind somehow, because of course, and it's not only our own anxiety, it affects relationships when you're like on your kids that way, for example. And she might have those thoughts, not with the same prevalence, maybe not with the same intensity, but they come, and now she laughs at it, because she also knows, as she describes herself, in a real situation where something's gone wrong, she's like a rock. She's steady, she's present, she's helpful. She's not intrusive. It's just when she's left alone with her mind,
Right.
spinning out, that she goes there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that makes me feel good to hear, because I have a very similar thing, a similar experience. And I've talked about this on the show before, is that in my mind, I'm this really weak, terrified person, and I'm not going to be able to handle anything. If anything goes wrong, it's all going to come apart. But in reality, I think there's actually some psychological studies that really anxious, neurotic people are actually the best in crisis situations. But I always use as an example, I'll go to, if I have blood taken or any kind of needle, or get anesthetized at the dentist, or whatever it is, I'll go, I really don't like needles. I get really freaked out. And they'll say, well, what do you mean? Like, what happens? And I'm like, I just get really nervous. And then they're like, well, do you pass out? Do you run out of the chair? And I was like, oh, no, nothing like that. And they're like, oh, that, to them, that's bad. Some people take blood and they pass out, or they run away, or they punch the doctor in the face. I'm like, oh no, I'm just uncomfortable.
That would be bad.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a tooth extraction, and the dentist, there was stitches in there, and he was taking the stitches out, and I was like, I'm sweating. I don't know if I can do this. And then when he was doing it, I was completely still. And he's like, you just handled that better than 95% of patients. It's just my anxiety, and he's not even noticing it really. So I feel similarly, and I've always been a hypochondriac too. So same thing. If I have knee pain, I'm going to need knee surgery. If I have a headache, I got a brain tumor, whatever it is. But yeah, now through meditation and therapy as well, it allows myself to kind of go, it's probably not that. And it's much more short-lived. It's still there. I still have those thoughts, but it's much more short-lived, which feels like progress.
It's huge progress, and it's real progress, because I think we would all like the great breakthrough experience, after which none of the stuff ever came up again. But I think that's not what happens. I think that it still arises. We relate very differently to it. It doesn't last as long. We don't take it in as deeply. This sort of like, I call it the Swiss cheese theory of transformation. It's like we poke holes in it even as it's there.
Right.
So it's not like solid and inflexible. It's like, oh yeah, maybe not,
Right. I've heard the analogy about, zebras, looking for zebras or something in the medical field, where if you're in New York City, I live in New York, and I think you did as well, or do. And if you hear like a clip clop in the street, most likely it's a horse. There's horses in New York, but like hypochondria anxiety is like, that's probably a zebra. I bet that's a zebra. And you're like, well, there could be a zebra walking up 7th Avenue, but most likely it's a horse. And so I feel that way I always use that analogy of when I'm feeling sick or whatever it is, and I think, oh I must be dying. I'm sort of going, that's probably a horse, if that makes sense. And it does, help me. Yeah. But that's how I've always been, is this alarmist. And I talked about a year ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago now, I had a sore throat, and I went to an ENT, and he diagnosed me with silent reflux, or LPR, whatever you call it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have no voice. I'm going to have esophageal cancer. And now I've realized a year later, after a year of that, I realized, oh, my throat's sore for a few hours after I eat pizza. it's fine. But anyway, so I owe all of this to the combination of meditation and therapy is what I'm getting at here. But I
As I said, I started practicing Buddhism, and pretty seriously, I went on some long retreats before I got sober. And when I got sober, I kept meditating, and I kind of got back into it after sort of drifting from it somewhat. I got sort of back into it, but I was so busy like rebuilding my life in all the practical ways. I kind of had thought like meditation will fix my life, but and I neglected all the things that practical things. So, I got sober and I went back to school and things started to really change in terms of the externals for sure, as well as the internals. And then at like 6-7 years sober, I started to get really seriously back into meditation. And now I had more of a, healthy psychological framework to build on, and so my meditation practice really deepened. And I live in Berkeley. There were 2 teachers here who had regular classes, and I became close with both of them and sat with them a lot. And I was going on 10-day retreats every year, sometimes 2-week retreats. And so at about 12 years sober, this one year, a lot happened. Like I got engaged and I got invited into a teacher training program. Because there was sort of at that point, most of the Buddhist teachers were like teaching retreats, like longer retreats, but there was an increasing sort of need for people to teach more just sort of drop-in classes and like a day long and things. And some of the senior teachers realized, oh, there's a lot of people around like me. I mean, I've been practicing for 15, 17 years. A lot of people around who have the background to be teachers, but they're not going to commit to teaching month-long retreats or something, So let's train them. And so the Spirit Rock Meditation Center, where I was trained and where I now I'm a regular, have a monthly class there. They started a program and they invited me into it called Community Dharma Leaders. And we had a 2-year teacher training program. And during that time, I started to teach regularly, and pretty quickly I realized that there was this subset of the Buddhist community who were sober or were in recovery. And so I started to offer things for them. Especially. Yeah.
And this is Spirit Rock. Is that Jack Cornfield?
Yes. Yes. Jack is the founder, or one of the co-founders there. Yeah.
Yeah. He's wonderful. He's one of the guys that I found early when I started sort of discovering meditation. And there was a time in my life where I was really, right before I got married, I was dealing with all this panic attacks that I hadn't had in a long time. And it was a really hard time, and I went to this bookstore and saw The Wise Heart, his book, The Wise Heart, and it was like an old used hardcover copy, and it was like a savior. It was amazing. And
he's a terrific teacher. He has he has a very deep understanding of Buddhism. He's also interested in a wide variety of kind of mystical traditions, but he's also a PhD psychologist. And, he's able to really he's able to really connect that deep Buddhist psychology with contemporary Western emotional stuff and our human, our humanness, take it down off the mountaintop. And his book, A Path with Heart, which is from about 92 or 93, is kind of similar to A Wise Heart. A lot of stories. It's more, whereas A Wise Heart is like specifically, like he says, Buddhist psychology. A Path with Heart is called a guide to the promises and perils of the spiritual path. And that really helped me. I've seen a lot of people in recovery. It helped me in my recovery. I think for similar reasons that you're describing. It really gets to stuff that's very meaningful and very practical at the same time.
Yeah, it's amazing that all these things sort of work in concert, which is one of those terms that I've heard people use, so I use.
Yeah,
But
good.
it is amazing how much, and to me, all of the things that really help me all come back to acceptance. I mean, sobriety,
Yeah.
12-step program, and Buddhism and meditation and therapy. I still go to therapy every week for years,
Mm-hmm.
and so many of these things come back to acceptance. It's so much of suffering is just resisting something that is.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating because so many of these things are counterintuitive. Like when I was someone that had a lot of panic attacks, it was so hard. I would get so like livid with my therapist, who would say, you have to accept it. You're fighting it. It doesn't work to fight it. And it would make me crazy. And then all of a sudden, like so many things, sobriety is like this for me, there is like this moment of clarity where you're like, oh, I see. And to just experience it and go, oh, here's my anxiety, my stomach's, and to kind of sit and just experience these appearances in consciousness of, oh, my stomach feels a little funny, my heart's beating faster than it normally would, or I feel a little dizzy. And to realize that all of these things are just sort of experiences in consciousness, and you're not gonna die from anxiety or panic attack. And it's amazing how, but I guess I don't even know if I have a question. I'll just stop talking and volley it to you. But the acceptance is this through line through all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And I think it needs support. It needs support. It needs the support of compassion, and it needs the support of mindfulness, and it needs the support of wisdom. So what I mean by that is that when you're going through a panic attack, it really helps when you can have this attitude of compassion towards yourself. Like, oh, this is really difficult, and this would be hard for anybody, not just me, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And mindfulness, which is accepting it, means that I'm actually going to have to feel it. And that takes some practice to feel, to learn how to feel. So you need that clarity. And then the wisdom, one of the key, there's two wisdom factors, particularly. One is the reminder of impermanence. Oh, this is going to pass. So that's one of the things that makes it possible to accept it. Because if you think this is going to last forever, which is how it feels,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be really hard to accept. You're going to think like, no, I can't live with this forever.
Right.
But in remembering, oh, it's impermanent. Okay, that helps. And what you were talking about before, which is it's not me. And one of the things that I like to point to, and this is a mindfulness kind of perspective as well, is experiencing anxiety and depression as energetic states rather than as psychological states. Because they are,
Right.
I mean, they're both, but when you bring mindfulness to the energetic level, it takes you out of the mental, argument or struggle, and takes you just onto this visceral experience oh wow, that's intense. And we know, like, the line between anxiety and elation is very blurry. Put
Right.
somebody on a roller coaster, wow, they're sort of in a panic state, but they're enjoying it,
Right.
so and I don't know, I mean, depression too can be felt as an energy, as like, oh, this is just this heavy energy in my body. And of course, one of the antidotes to both of them is to respond physically. And it happens that the antidote to both of them is activity, right?
Right.
When you're active when there's anxiety, that's a way of burning it off, or kind of dissipating it. And when you're active with depression, it's a way of bringing the energy that you need. So I just find that it takes it out of this realm of like, oh, I have a problem. Oh God, like I'm anxious. What's wrong with me? Why am I anxious? What do I have to change in the world or in my life to fix that so that I won't? It's like, there's always something to be afraid of. I mean, you're going to die. We should be walking around in fear all the time. We don't know
Right.
when we're going to die. Shit. I mean, damn, that's really a problem.
Right. It is, but it's interesting because that's the thing with impermanence, is it works for this too shall pass, works with the good and the bad.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way, and it talks about that in the 12 steps of, we shouldn't get too excited either. Excitement can be bad.
Absolutely. I mean, I drank when I was happy because let's have fun. And I would drink when I was not happy because it was like I needed to cheer up. So it's just, yeah, that's so interesting. And what that's pointing to in Buddhist terms is that we want to let go of all of it.
Right.
Don't be attached to the good or the bad. Just see it all as this is just what's happening. It's coming, it's going. No reason to hold on to it. Enjoy it if it's pleasant. Don't fight it if it's unpleasant. And it's not going to become a problem.
Mindful Metal Jacket is hosted by comedian Joe List. Produced by Joe List. Edited by Matt Kleinschmidt. Executive producers Robert Kelly and Matt Kleinschmidt for the Laugh Button Podcast.